In 2022, scientists tested the DNA of 9,000-year-old skeletons from one of the most important ancient sites on Earth. And what they found didn't just surprise archaeologists. It completely broke the story we've been told about early human civilization. These weren't the people historians thought they were. They didn't live the way we believed. And the society we thought was peaceful, equal, and advanced may have been something very different. Sacred sites have always carried a strange kind of weight, places where ancient people gathered to worship, to connect with something beyond themselves, to make sense of life, death, and everything in between. Sites like Stonehenge, Angkor Wat, and Machu Picchu dominate how we imagine the ancient world. They feel advanced, mysterious, almost impossible. And because of that, they shape the way we think about early humans. We imagine slow development, simple beginnings, gradual progress towards civilization. But there is one site that quietly challenged all of that, and for years, almost no one outside academic circles paid attention to it. Introducing the site, it's called Çatalhöyük. Located in central Turkey, this site dates back roughly 9,000 years, and for decades it was considered one of the most important discoveries in human history, because according to archaeologists, Çatalhöyük wasn't just a settlement, it was one of the first real human communities, a place where people lived together in tightly packed homes, shared space, shared resources, a place where society, as we know it, was beginning to take shape. And more importantly, it was believed to represent something rare, something almost ideal, an early example of equality. For years, the story seemed clear. Çatalhöyük was a peaceful, egalitarian society. Men and women lived as equals. There was no clear evidence of kings, rulers, or rigid class systems. Homes were nearly identical in size and structure. No palaces, no obvious elites. And then there were the figurines, hundreds of small statues, many of them depicting women, with emphasized features linked to fertility and life. These figurines were interpreted as evidence of a mother goddess religion, a belief system centered around feminine power. And from that, a powerful narrative emerged that early human societies were not violent, not hierarchical, not dominated by power structures, but cooperative, balanced, even progressive. Çatalhöyük became something bigger than just an archaeological site. It became a symbol of what humanity could have been, a world where people lived differently. But then something changed. Around 2019, researchers returned to Çatalhöyük with tools that earlier archaeologists didn't have. Not better shovels, not better excavation techniques, but something far more powerful: DNA sequencing, isotope analysis, and artificial intelligence. For the first time, they could analyze not just artifacts, but the people themselves, their bones, their diets, their genetic relationships, and more importantly, they could look at patterns across the entire population, not just individual discoveries, but the full system. The first question was simple: who were these people? For decades, the answer seemed obvious. They were local, an indigenous Anatolian population, people who had lived in that region for generations, who developed agriculture, who built their own culture from the ground up. But the DNA told a completely different story. These people weren't from one place. They came from multiple regions. Some carried genetic markers linked to the Fertile Crescent, others to the Levant. Some even showed connections to regions near the Caucasus. This wasn't a single population, it was a mix, and that changes everything. Because if the people themselves weren't stable, then the society couldn't have been either. As researchers looked deeper into the genetic data, another pattern emerged. The population wasn't just mixed, it was changing over time. Different genetic groups appeared in different periods. Some phases showed continuity, families staying in place for generations, but other phases showed something else entirely. Rapid turnover, new populations arriving, old ones disappearing, which raises a serious question. If this was a peaceful, stable society, why was the population constantly changing? This is where artificial intelligence came in. Researchers fed massive amounts of data into AI systems: bone density, skeletal size, stress markers, disease indicators, and asked a simple question: what patterns exist in how these people live? The answer was not what anyone expected. The first major finding was clear. Not everyone lived the same life. Some individuals showed strong, healthy bone structures, good nutrition, minimal physical stress. Others showed something very different: signs of malnutrition, heavy labor, long-term physical strain. This wasn't equality. This was hierarchy. Even without kings or palaces, there were clear differences in how people lived, and that was just the beginning. Because when researchers looked closer, they found something even harder to ignore. Across the skeletal remains, patterns of injury started to appear: fractures, blunt force trauma, signs of repeated damage. Some injuries had healed, which meant people survived attacks. Others had not. These weren't accidents, they followed patterns. Men showed higher rates of violence, but women weren't untouched. Some showed defensive wounds, injuries consistent with trying to protect themselves. Others showed fatal trauma. This wasn't a peaceful society. It was a place where conflict existed, where violence was part of life. And if that was true, if this society wasn't equal, wasn't peaceful, wasn't stable, by now the picture was already starting to change. Çatalhöyük wasn't the peaceful, equal society historians once believed. The DNA didn't match, the population wasn't stable, and the bones showed clear signs of inequality and violence. But that was only the surface, because when researchers looked deeper, they found something even more disturbing. If a society isn't equal, then the next question is obvious: who had power? At first, archaeologists believed Çatalhöyük had no clear hierarchy, no kings, no rulers, no elite class, but AI analysis started to reveal patterns that weren't visible before. Patterns in burials. In Çatalhöyük, people were buried inside their homes, under floors, beneath platforms, within the same spaces where daily life happened. At first glance, this seemed equal, everyone buried in similar ways. But when researchers analyzed it systematically, a pattern emerged. Some individuals were buried in more central positions, more prominent locations. Some were surrounded by more objects, more tools, more ornaments, more effort in burial. Others were not. And when they cross-referenced this with biological data, the difference became clearer. And higher status individuals had better nutrition, less physical stress, longer lifespans. Lower status individuals had signs of heavy labor, malnutrition, shorter lives. This wasn't subtle, this was structure. And then they noticed something even more specific. For decades, Çatalhöyük was seen as a symbol of female power because of the figurines, small statues of women, often emphasized, symbolic, linked to fertility. These were interpreted as evidence of a mother goddess religion, a society where women held spiritual authority. But the new data told a different story. When researchers examined burial wealth, positioning, grave goods, a pattern appeared. In many periods, men received more elaborate burials. Men were placed in more central locations. Men were associated with higher status objects, not women. That changes everything. Because if women held power, why weren't they treated as the highest status individuals in death? The figurines suddenly looked different, not as evidence of power, but possibly something else: representation, idealization, or even control. Instead of showing real authority, they might reflect symbolic importance, a way of honoring women's role in reproduction, while denying them actual power in society. And that idea becomes stronger when you look at how space was used. Çatalhöyük houses were tightly packed, no streets, no open squares. People moved across rooftops. Inside, each house had multiple areas, storage spaces, living areas, work zones. But when AI analyzed spatial patterns, it revealed something critical. Certain areas, especially storage spaces, were associated with higher status individuals, and those individuals were more often male. Activities linked to value, tool making, trade preparation, were concentrated in specific zones, while other activities, food preparation, textile work, child care, were separated. This wasn't random, this was organization, and that organization reflected power. And then came one of the darkest findings of all. Some skeletons stood out immediately, not because of status, but because of damage, extreme physical strain, repetitive injuries, long-term skeletal stress. These individuals had worse health, shorter lifespans, more signs of disease, and they were often found in specific areas, grouped, separated from others. This raised a disturbing possibility. These weren't just low-status individuals. They may have been something else entirely, servants, laborers, or even slaves. Think about that. A society once described as peaceful and equal now shows signs of hierarchy, violence, and possibly servitude. The evidence of violence also became clearer over time. It wasn't random, it followed patterns. Certain individuals were more likely to be injured, certain groups more exposed to danger. This suggests something important. Violence wasn't accidental, it was part of the system. Conflict, competition, control, all embedded within the society itself. And then researchers asked another question. If this society wasn't equal and wasn't peaceful, then how did it survive for so long? For years, Çatalhöyük was seen as an early farming village, a place where agriculture began to dominate. But isotope analysis told a different story. By studying chemical signatures in bones, scientists could reconstruct diet, and what they found was unexpected. People weren't relying mainly on farming, they were hunting. Wild animals, wild plants, agriculture existed, but it wasn't dominant. This means Çatalhöyük wasn't a traditional farming village. It may have been something else entirely, a gathering place, a hub, a center of activity. One resource stood out above all others: obsidian, a volcanic glass used to make sharp tools, highly valuable, widely traded. And Çatalhöyük was connected to major obsidian sources. This wasn't just a settlement, it was part of a trade network. And where there is trade, there is something else: competition. And where there is competition, there is conflict. By now the picture was clear. Çatalhöyük wasn't a peaceful utopia. It was something far more familiar. A society shaped by power, by inequality, by struggle. But the final piece of the puzzle would change everything, because the biggest discovery wasn't about how they lived, it was about where they came from. By this point, the story had already changed. Çatalhöyük wasn't peaceful, it wasn't equal, it wasn't stable. It was a place of hierarchy, of labor, of conflict. But one question still remained: where did these people come from? The DNA analysis didn't just show that people came from different regions, it showed something bigger: the patterns of movement across thousands of years. New groups kept arriving. Some blended in, some replaced others, and some brought entirely new genetic signatures. This wasn't a closed society, it was part of a much larger human story. Some of the most important genetic markers pointed to populations from the north and east, from the steppes. These were mobile groups, pastoral people, highly adaptable. And later in history, they would become associated with massive expansions across Europe and Asia. But here at Çatalhöyük, we're seeing the early stages of that movement. This site wasn't isolated. It was a meeting point, a place where different populations came together. Sometimes peacefully, sometimes not. A place where cultures mixed and clashed, and that explains something we saw earlier. The patterns of violence now make more sense, because this wasn't just internal conflict. Some of it may have been external. New groups arriving, resources being contested, control being challenged, which turned Çatalhöyük into something very different. Not just a settlement, but a frontier, a place where different ways of life collided. Hunters, traders, migrants, all interacting in one space. That kind of environment doesn't stay peaceful for long. But there was another factor shaping everything: the environment. Researchers compared the timeline of changes at Çatalhöyük with climate data, and the overlap was clear. Periods of drought, shifts in rainfall, changes in temperature, all matched periods of instability. When resources were stable, the society held together. When resources became scarce, everything changed. Conflict increased, population shifts accelerated, hierarchy became more extreme. This reveals something deeper. The structure of society wasn't fixed, it responded to pressure. When survival was easy, cooperation was possible. When survival became difficult, competition took over. And that leads to one final question. What was life actually like for the people living there? The answer is brutal. Most people did not live well. Skeletal analysis showed high levels of disease, frequent infections, malnutrition, physical stress. Life expectancy was low. Many people didn't live past 30. Child mortality was high, and women bore the heaviest burden. Repeated pregnancies, heavy labor, nutritional stress, all left marks on their bones. Many didn't survive childbirth. Those who did showed long-term damage. The final picture. At this point, the illusion is gone. Çatalhöyük wasn't a golden age. It wasn't a perfect society lost to time. It was something far more familiar, a human society, with inequality, with conflict, with suffering. The big realization, and that changes how we see the past, because for decades, this site represented hope, proof that humans once lived differently, more equally, more peacefully, but the evidence doesn't support that. The patterns we see today, hierarchy, competition, struggle for power, they aren't new. They've been with us for thousands of years. So reframing history. This doesn't mean humans are doomed, but it does mean something important. We can't understand ourselves if we misunderstand our past, because if even one of our most celebrated ancient societies wasn't what we thought it was, then what else have we gotten wrong? How many other civilizations have been misunderstood? How many stories were shaped more by what we wanted to believe than by what actually happened? Because now we know something for sure. The past wasn't simple, it wasn't peaceful, and it definitely wasn't perfect. It was human, and maybe that's the most uncomfortable truth of all.